Hey, this is Derek, and you're listening to Skepticality, the official audio program of Skeptic Magazine, for Tuesday, October 2nd, 2012.
Skepticality. Science!
Welcome back to another episode of Skepticality, the show which features news and interviews with people from all walks of life for the promotion of critical thought and science. So it looks like we'll be back on our normal schedule at least for a couple weeks. This is going to be another long episode. We have 2 interviews coming up. So, as always, first up is Tim Farley with his look at the past and future of the world of skeptics.
I'm Tim Farley of whatstheharm.net and skeptools.com, and this is Skepticism Past and Future. In the past, we've got testable religious claims, and in the future, we've got a continuing parade of skeptical tools being introduced. Skeptics often disagree about the boundaries between scientific skepticism and the criticism of religion, but most would agree that when there is a clear, testable claim, the intersection is certain. Several events relating to this overlap coincidentally took place on October 13th. One of the most famous Marian apparitions occurred in 1917 in Fatima, Portugal. On October 13th of that year, a so-called miracle of the sun was observed by thousands present. Many ophthalmological explanations have been offered, often hinging on the fact that many pilgrims stared at the sun at length. But of course it is hard to test a claim that only happened once. More recently, the Nancy Fowler Marian apparitions in Conyers, Georgia in the 1990s also took place on the 13th of the month, including in October. In those events, pilgrims used their cameras to photograph a so-called golden doorway to heaven. This was actually found to be an image of the camera's own internal aperture in an investigation carried out by Anson Kennedy and Dale Hetherington of the Georgia Skeptics. Finally, it was a press conference on October 13, 1988, in which the Archbishop of Turin, Italy, announced that a carbon dating test had been done on the Shroud of Turin, and the fabric had been dated to medieval times. The results, which conclusively showed that the shroud was a forgery, were later published in the journal Nature. Back in April, I wrote a blog post entitled, "Is 2012 the Year of Skeptical Software Tools?" The reason I asked is it seemed like a host of tools targeted at identifying and avoiding misinformation online were being proposed or built. Tools that I've talked about here, including Hypothesis and Rebutter. Well, I'm pleased to report that 2012 has continued to be the year of new tools, and several new ones were introduced just recently. One is unsourced.org, which is a website and browser extension that provides links to the source material, such as scientific papers, that news articles online often fail to identify. It also calls out articles for having misleading headlines or for simply regurgitating a press release. The information in the tool is crowdsourced from the general public, so skeptics can help provide data to make the tool work better. Another browser extension is not about misinformation per se, but about partisanship and political slant. It's called Balancer, and it warns you if the sources you read skew predominantly in the same political direction. It can then give you reading suggestions to vary your sources. In a similar vein, two different groups in the U.S. have launched smartphone apps which will identify political ads from their audio and call up the financial disclosures of the sponsoring organizations, as well as any fact-checking that has been done on the claims in the ad. One of the apps is called Super PAC, and the other one is called Ad Hawk. And finally, a new website called Truth Market can be used to fund cash challenges for proof of contested claims, similar to the $1 Million Challenge offered by the James Randi Educational Foundation. Anyone can propose a challenge, and the prize funds are collected from interested users of the site via contributions. If someone comes forward to answer the challenge, they must provide some evidence that will be examined by a trusted panel of experts. Either the challenger or the challengee can win the money, depending on the judgment of the panel. It's an interesting idea, useful for all sorts of claims, political, scientific, or otherwise. They just launched in September, and already there are challenges involving climate change and other key skeptic issues on the site. I encourage all skeptics to take advantage of one or more of these fantastic tools. They are powerful ways to arm yourself against misinformation. And this brings us to the end of another edition of Skepticism Past and Future. Links to additional material are in the show notes, and follow me on Twitter or Facebook under the name Krelnik, Krelnik, for a daily fact from skepticism's past and ongoing news of skepticism's future.
This is Bob Carroll, creator of the Skeptic's Dictionary and the blog Unnatural Acts That Can Improve Your Thinking. Welcome to another episode of Unnatural Virtue. Today's topic is telepathy. Wouldn't it be great to be able to read another person's mind? Actually, we do it all the time. Well, maybe we don't have direct mind-to-mind contact, but we can often figure out what somebody else is thinking if we know them well enough and are in just the right situation. It gets a little harder when we try to figure out what a stranger is thinking, especially if he's thousands of miles away. Yet there are many people who believe that it is possible to get mental messages from the minds of total strangers at short or great distances. The term telepathy was coined by psychical investigator Frederick W. H. Myers in an 1882 article in the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research to describe mind-to-mind communication. Myers was a classic scholar and one of the founders of modern psychology. That same year, Sir William Fletcher Barrett, a professor of physics at the Royal College of Sciences in Dublin, and a few friends, including the Cambridge philosopher Henry Sidgwick, formed the still existing Society for Psychical Research, the SPR. The goal of the society, in part, according to Sidgwick, was to drive the objector into the position of being forced either to admit the phenomena as inexplicable, at least by him, or to accuse the investigators either of lying or cheating or of a blindness or forgetfulness incompatible with any intellectual condition except absolute idiocy. The SPR's first scientific study would have Sidgwick eating those words. Barrett led SPR's first study, and it lasted 6 years, from 1882 to 1888. The scientist used a number of guessing experiments with a clergyman's 4 teenage daughters and a servant girl, who claimed they could communicate telepathically. Barrett declared that the girls defied the odds with their guessing. In one experiment, for example, he said that the odds were over 1,000,000 to 1, but the girls succeeded. In another, he said the odds that their guessing correctly 5 cards in a row were over 142 million to 1, yet they guessed them. Barrett brought in more men of integrity with high degrees to witness the telepathic powers of the Creary sisters and Jane Dean, their servant. All the scientists agreed there was no trickery involved, and that the most logical explanation for their successful guessing was that they weren't guessing at all, but were communicating telepathically. Now, how did the scientists know that the girls weren't cheating? They had looked very carefully for signs of cheating and couldn't find any. A skeptic might ask, what are the odds that children can fool some very intelligent scientists for 6 years about the paranormal? The answer is, the odds are very good. Almost immediately, the scientists were criticized for being taken in by tricks amateurs could perform. It took 6 years for these rather intelligent men of the SPR to catch the girls cheating using a verbal code and discover their trickery. This was not an isolated incident, however. While Barrett and his crew were validating the query group, another group from SPR was validating the amazing telepathic feats of a 19-year-old entertainer named George A. Smith and his partner in deception, Douglas Blackburn. Smith eventually became secretary of the SPR. Had Blackburn not eventually published a series of articles explaining how they had fooled the scientists, the world might never have known the details of the trickery. The early scientific studies demonstrate the naivete of the experimenters and the need for experts in nonverbal communication and deception, namely conjurers or gamblers, to help them set up protocols to prevent cheating. It took some time to sink in, but eventually the experimenters realized that for some reason human beings like to deceive each other. They use all kinds of verbal and nonverbal signals to communicate, which can give the appearance of psychic transmission of information. They use glances, up, down, right, left for the four suits of a deck of cards, for example, coughs, sighs, yawns, noises with their shoes. Other cheaters use Morse code with coins and various other tricks known to conjurers. Sometimes gestures to various parts of the body have a prearranged meaning. Skip ahead to the 20th and 21st centuries. Psychical investigation is now called paranormal investigation, and though guessing experiments are still at the core of the attempts to discover telepathy, 3 important changes have occurred from those early days when cheating was easy and rampant. 1. Elaborate efforts to avoid cheating by participants in the studies have been implemented. 2. The researchers now study groups of people in their guessing experiments. Dozens of subjects are now tested in a variety of ways to see if overall the group doesn't guess at a level that is not likely due to chance. Guess what? Many experimenters have produced results that are not likely due to chance. Even skeptics agree with this finding. But the skeptics think that there are other non-paranormal explanations for the statistical results than that telepathic communication has occurred. The third important change since telepathy research began in the mid-19th century is the fact that mind-body dualism has given way in many quarters to materialistic monism, the view that the brain is the seat of consciousness and that there is no separate reality called the mind that exists independently of the brain. When the issue was mind-to-mind communication, there was no limit to what researchers might imagine as a mechanism for telepathy. But with brain-to-brain communication, the physical limits of what mechanisms are plausible are limited by what we know about how brains work. Well, this is not the place to go over the data. The show notes will direct you to places on the Skeptic's Dictionary where I review the most important studies on telepathy. Suffice it to say here that no individual in any of the hundreds of studies on telepathy has been put on exhibition as capable of reading even a 3-letter word from 3 paces in another person's mind at a greater than chance rate over the long haul. In other words, telepathy may exist, but so far we haven't identified a single person with telepathic ability. Well, you knew I was going to say that, didn't you? Well, that's it for this episode of Unnatural Virtue. To find out more about telepathy, see my website, The Skeptic's Dictionary. And in the meantime, please commit some unnatural acts in public. And don't forget, skepticism, though unnatural, is a virtue.
Hello and welcome to The Odds Must Be Crazy on Skepticality, where we open every single episode with some sort of funny description of what we do here. Except this one. You'll just have to figure it out yourself.
I'm Wendy Hughes.
And I'm Jarrett Kaufman, and we're here to reprogram your minds about probability and happenstance.
You know, I'm a Mac user, and I don't know any of that :/ stuff, Jarrett.
Yeah, that's already clear from how you started. Don't worry, I'll translate it.
If you taught me to use Twitter, you can do anything.
You give me far too much credit, Wendy. This week's story comes to us courtesy of blog reader David Buck, and can be found on our blog starting today under the name The Contract Coincidence, or via the link in the show notes.
David's story about an interesting aspect of the employment crisis and IT shows a refreshing understanding of the law of large numbers. David writes,
I work on contract in the software development field, and I specialize in small talk programming, a relatively obscure programming language these days. I normally have a full-time contract, but one day my project leader told me that there would be a gap in the contract, and it might be several weeks or months before they could get me back in. I went into find work mode and thought about companies I'd done business with in the past. I decided that I'd contact one insurance company first. I hadn't heard from them since November 18th, 2003, some 5 years earlier. The last I heard, they needed to do an upgrade, and I thought that if they hadn't done it yet, I might be able to help them out. I frequently do this work under a subcontract for the small talk vendor, so I decided to email my contact there, a fellow named Jim. On the morning of January 28th, 2010, I emailed Jim to suggest that we contact the insurance company to see if they needed any work done. I mentioned that I last heard from them in 2003. Jim agreed and asked me to send him the email address of the contact person. I didn't have that email address on my smartphone, so I told Jim that I'd send it to him after I got home a few hours later. Well, less than a few hours later, before I got home, I got an email out of the blue from the senior manager of the insurance company. He wanted to know whether I still did that kind of work and whether I was available to do the upgrade work for them. At no point did Jim or I communicate with them about this work. They just sent the request on their own on the very day that we were planning to contact them. I forwarded it to Jim and we started contract negotiations. I ended up getting a contract with them for 6 months and successfully completed the upgrade for them. So what are the odds that in the 3 or 4 hours between Jim and I agreeing to email them and actually emailing them, that they would email me instead after 5 years of no contact? Weird. The law of large numbers works in mysterious ways.
So his question is about how he needed a job, contacted a go-between, and was offered a job by the company before the go-between could even make contact. Ordinarily, I'd gasp with amazement, but since we're the odds must be crazy, we'll ask someone who can determine the probability of this happening.
You're only saying that because you already gasped with amazement. Anyway, when our own personal cognitive psychologist, Barbara Drescher, reviewed the story, she was very careful to assess the timing and dates reported by the contributor. She then explained that because some of his data does not add up quite right, some of it can be explained by the fallibility of memory, and also that some information is missing.
For example, what part of the data was a little off-kilter?
Barbara says, first, I have to question the reliability of the timing this author outlines, because his numbers don't add up. The timing is not particularly relevant, but it does demonstrate a possible fallibility of memory or documentation.
I call that the Elizabeth Loftus fallacy. You'd have to Google her. But what it's really about is the malleability of memory, something that Barbara and Ani Aharonian talked about at DragonCon. It's important because it affects eyewitness testimony in legal disputes and shows how important corroborating evidence is in every aspect of decision-making. What else was in Barbara's analysis?
Barbara goes on. Setting that aside, it sounds a lot more unusual than it is. The author not only knew the manager and had worked for him in the past, but knew that he'd done a good enough job that the manager might be interested in working with him again. So it's not unusual at all that the manager would contact the author when he had work to be done.
So, since David had done well on the job in the past, and since he had been an independent contractor, there was a good chance eventually he'd be contacted by the old employer. But how about the timing?
Barbara said that this is some of the missing information. This leaves the probability that the manager would need to hire someone on the day the author needed to find work. That is difficult to determine without a good understanding of what was going on in the industry at the time. I think we can all agree that it is an interesting coincidence, but not a shocking one. In other words, without knowing more specific details, it's an interesting coincidence, but more information would be necessary to exactly calculate the probability and decide where it fits on the scale between practically guaranteed and jaw-dropping.
Well, it's certainly a good thing he did such good work in order to get called back again. It's always more important to rely on your own efforts than rely on luck. Although I do still catch myself crossing my fingers occasionally. I guess old habits die hard.
That's not too bad. At least you're not one of those people who won't wash her lucky socks.
Anyway, thanks for listening to The Odds Must Be Crazy on Skepticality. Please visit our website at theoddsmustbecrazy.com or type Crazy Odds into Google and hit the I'm Feeling Lucky button. Then tell us just how lucky you were in our comment threads, assuming your luck pertains to the story you're commenting on. In the meantime, don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, circle us on Google+, and validate us in life. Hit the Submit a Story link on our site to share your own crazy stories. Or tweet the short ones with the hashtag TOMBC.
The Odds Must Be Crazy is a project in collaboration with the Independent Investigations Group in Los Angeles, California. Visit them at iigwest.org. Barbara Drescher is a contributing editor to our blog and can also be found at icbseverywhere.com.
Special thanks to our producer and sound engineer, Brian Hart. Our theme music comes to us courtesy of Mr. Deity himself, Brian Keith Dalton. You can find him at MrDeity.com.
And until the next episode, make sure you do your job well, always come back from lunch on time, and make sure it's actually Friday before you wear your Hawaiian shirt to work for Casual Friday.
And don't get me started on Topless Tuesday.
Trust me, I won't.
Hey, Barry.
Yes, Rebecca.
Barry, I have some concerns about SciCon. You know, it's coming up soon, October 25th to 28th. And as you recall, I was there last year.
Yes.
And I had a great time, but I heard a rumor that this year there will not be a fancy apple bar.
Well, right now, Rebecca, I do not have an apple bar planned.
Well,
I will be honest with you.
Barry, why should I go?
You should go, Rebecca, because some of the biggest names in skepticism are going to be there.
Like who?
Well, to start off, Richard Weissman. He's our MC for the event. People like Chris Mooney, Andrei Viscontas, David Gorski, John Ronson, who I think you know, Elizabeth Loftus, Carol Tavares, Eugenie Scott, Joe Nickel, Ben Radford, Steve Novella. I mean, they keep flooding my mind how many these great people are coming. Skeptics are going to be there. Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. They're doing a live broadcast. What else do you need?
Well, Barry, your enthusiasm is infectious. However, what else have you got? Come on.
What else have I got?
What else?
Well, like last year, we're doing a costume party.
Okay, I did have a lot of fun with that last year.
Yes. We're also doing a blood drive, vampire blood drive, I think.
Fits with the theme.
Fits with the
I
theme,
like
Halloween, yes. We also have the local astronomy club in Nashville. They're coming, setting up their telescopes. We're doing a thing called Starry, Starry Night. Is that good? No, not enough.
No, that was a really great apple bar.
Well, how about this? We're doing a honky-tonk bus trip to the bars downtown.
A what bus trip?
Honky-tonk.
Never say that again. Never
Honky-tonk.
say it again. Look, the apple bar was like a crucial part of my diet last year.
Rebecca, we're having an authentic Tennessee, Nashville barbecue event. Open
Really?
barbecue, plenty of pork and beef and chicken and...
Barry, I'm a vegetarian.
Vegetarian. Well, do you know, Rebecca, we're also having a moonshine tasting event.
I'll be there.
For more information on SciCon, the conference dedicated to science and skeptical inquiry happening this October 25th through the 28th in Nashville, Tennessee, visit csiconference.org.
Thanks again to Tim, Bob, Wendy, and Jarrett. So, way back in 2006, one of our friends, Dr. Ginger Campbell, started her own podcast, the Brain Science Podcast. If you haven't heard about it, it's a science show all about that cool lump of stuff which resides in all of our skulls. Ginger has been active in some of her local skeptic events here in the Atlanta area, even though she's based in Alabama. So it was very cool when I found out she has just released her first book. Since we've never had her on Skepticality, I figured, well, it's about time. So, Ginger, I think I haven't seen you for almost a year now.
I think the last time I saw you was at TAM 9?
9. It was. See, it's been more than a year. I used to see you almost 2 or 3 times a year. What happened?
You tell me what's going on in Atlanta.
Well, everything. We had Dragon Con. You weren't there.
Yeah, I did miss it.
You did. So, I've never had you on the show before. We've been friends now for years since we started since I guess before podcasting had iTunes.
Well, not quite that long, because I discovered you guys on iTunes in the summer of 2005.
Yeah, it's the dreaded year of my stroke.
Yeah, I think I was listening to your back podcast coming back from a trip to Scotland around the time you had your stroke. So we didn't actually meet till 2007 when you were, just on the comeback trail.
Oh, okay. For some reason, it just feels longer than that.
Well, Derek, I want to thank you and Sweepy for helping me get started with my podcast because you played my Brain Science Podcast promo early on when I was first getting started and helped me get a lot of my earliest listeners that thankfully some of them are my long-term listeners. So I just want to tell you how much I appreciate that.
Yeah, well, I guess the next thing I was going to say you have a podcast of your own. It's the Brain Science Podcast, which is actually not why I have you on today, but we'll get to your book in a bit. Now, you yourself you're not a brain scientist, but you are in the medical profession.
Yes, I'm an emergency physician.
So what got you into the brain science part as your focus?
Well, it was part, you might say, of an intellectual journey through Eastern philosophy, and after many years of studying things like Buddhism, I came to Western philosophy, and I realized there was this whole area in Western philosophy called philosophy of mind that was right up at the intersection between philosophy and science, and that got me interested in neuroscience, which I hadn't paid attention to since I was a graduate student before I went to medical school. So that got me sort of interested in neuroscience again. And then when I heard the first podcast, the first two shows I listened to, I think, were Skepticality and The Signal, I was like, I want to do a podcast. But I don't want to do a show about medicine because that'd be too much like work. And it took me like a year to come up with the idea for the Brain Science Podcast. And I realized that my very first podcast was actually a very short book review for a show called the sci-fi something. I'm forgetting now. But anyway, it got me hooked, and I realized I would never run out of material. That's the key thing. And neuroscience has gotten so hot since I started in 2006 that my idea that I would never run out of material has certainly proven true.
Well, yeah, like brain science stuff has become the biggest focus for many people now, not just for skeptics, but just in pop culture. I mean, even TV shows now kind of focus around the ideas surrounding the brain science.
Not always accurately, but yeah.
Well, it doesn't matter if it's accurate. It's in the public mindset. So this book, Are You Sure? That's the book you just came out with. It's mainly an ebook. You can get on the Kindle stores and also on things like the iOS bookstore.
I haven't put it in the iBook store yet. The name of the book's Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty. And right now it's just a Kindle book. But what I've been doing is anybody that sends me their receipt from the Kindle, I will send them the PDF, which they can then read on whatever other device they're using. So I just haven't gotten around to submitting it to Apple because it's a lot more complicated to get into Apple than it is to get into Kindle. And I would like to mention that the way this book came about was thanks to Evo Terra. You know Evo. He, the founder of Patio Books, he's doing a new project now, an online, helping people learn how to do online books. And I beta tested a course for him. And so that's actually the reason that this is such a short book, is that I was trying to come up, I had a longer book idea, but I didn't have time to execute it. So I came up with this smaller project that sort of to test the process of how to go about getting a book into the right format for Kindle and get it published and whatnot. It's really based on a couple of my favorite brain science podcasts and one of my favorite guests, who was a neurologist named Robert Burton. Dr. Burton wrote a book called On Being Certain.
That's a good book. I've read that book.
Yeah, you remember that book?
Yeah.
And I think the subtitle is Why You're Sure You're Right Even When You're Not. And so when I read that book several years ago, I thought that the ideas in it were really important, so I did an episode on it, and then I also interviewed him. So this book is really based on those two episodes of the Brain Science Podcast. But I've gotten feedback from people who actually heard the episodes, because they were way back in the 40s of my episodes, and they said, they enjoyed hearing the material again. So even if you've already heard the episode, it's so good. But in the Kindle vernacular, it would be considered a Kindle short. So it's only like $2.99, I think, in the Kindle store.
I would think that books about the size of this one are what I've seen do quite well, at least when I go to work in my normal job, which is either they're the business people or the engineers. The books I usually end up buying are those little shorter books you always find like in the airports and things. This is like the size book that most people are attracted to these days for topics like these.
Also, they don't feel like they're spending a lot of money, so if it ends up to be something that they really didn't get into, they don't feel like they've, it's like buying an app, in the iTunes store, under $3, you're kind of like, well, maybe I like it, maybe I won't. Even though I know free has become, the trick path where you have to get by all the ads and the in-app purchases. But if you're going to still have a regular app, people usually are going to buy stuff like at that price range without too much, concern that they'll be disappointed. So
obviously, it's a book about something to do with brain science. And it's a little bit like the book On Being Certain, something like that.
Yeah, I would put it closer to Carol Tavris's work on cognitive dissonance. I don't know that Burton actually ever talked about cognitive dissonance, but the idea, the big focus of his writing was that we all have this. And we all have this when you really feel sure about something. Like when somebody asks you a question and you know the answer, but you might not be able to think about it, but you have this feeling that that's kind of the focus of what he was writing about. And the big point he was making, and I don't feel bad about giving it away because, I just don't. Maybe it's because I've done too many free podcasts. What can I say? But the main point is that whatever makes that happen is happening in a part of the brain that you cannot get conscious access to. And so there's been so many books put out about how great our intuition is, and books like Blink by Malcolm Gladwell that imply that we should have all this great confidence in this split decision making, sudden decision making. And the point is, since feeling sure is not a guarantee. Well, just like Elizabeth Loftus said in her talk last year at TAM, the study with false memory has shown that the emotional certainty you feel about a memory doesn't mean it's true.
Oh, it's definitely true. That actually happened to me recently. I was telling somebody about a few of my friends that I knew from college back in Vegas. They came to DragonCon this year. I was sitting down with a bunch of them, and other people were there for breakfast, and we all were sure about a date. And the next day, one of them actually had some material that he wanted to give me that was stuff that I've been looking for since I left Vegas, and on one of those things was the date itself, and we were off by like 3 years. Yeah. And we all swore it was 1996. And it was actually 1994, and we all swore it was 96 because of a movie and things. We looked on IMDb. It was obviously it's 96. It wasn't, and we were all completely sure of it. And then it reminded me of that talk you just talked about at TAM, where she said, especially when other people are there to reinforce the bad memory, then everybody starts to believe the false memory, and we all did until we found the actual printed date that we all talked about. It's like, oh, we were off by like 2 years, even though we all swore we saw this movie in the movie theater together. But that should have been 96, but it really wasn't. So it's amazing when you actually see it happen.
And you may recall also, I think that they were at TAM, but I've heard him speak at several different places, so I could have it confused. But when Stephen Macknick and his wife Susanna talked about the neuroscience of magic,
that was last year,
and they give a lot of examples, and then they finally come down to the bottom line, which says the point is that you have to test the thing you think is true. Just because you feel it's true, that's not the spot where you stop. Like you feel this choice is right, that's not the spot where you stop. Especially if it's going to be some, momentous decision that you're going to be making, then you might want to go past that feeling of certainty. And especially if somebody says something that they disagree with you, don't just automatically say, well, because I'm so sure that I'm right, I don't even need to look at their position. And of course, that's part of critical thinking. But even people that consider themselves skeptics are just as prone to this feeling of certainty and trusting it.
Well, yeah, I think it's a human trait, though. It's probably the same thing.
Well, and this brings me back to the cognitive dissonance issue, which basically what Carol would say is that, and of course, she credits the original founder of cognitive dissonance, but Leon Festinger, but what she's just very eloquent in describing it is that we need that feeling in order to be able to move on. We need to be able to feel certain about our choices, otherwise we would just sit around and dither. So that feeling probably has a evolutionary reason behind it. In other words, whatever the circuits in our unconscious are that vote, and one of them comes out the winner, and that's the one that makes it to consciousness, and it comes with that, I think some people call it emotional valence. It comes with that feeling of rightness, because that's what grabs us and makes us remember it. It's because that's the only way, we could survive. I mean, people follow leaders that seem certain, even so sometimes they are wrong. My husband's always telling me I have no sense of direction, but I can say, turn right here, in such a tone of voice. He says, why do you always talk to me in your doctor voice? You always get me to turn in the wrong direction.
Well, that's what you do. You do that all the time at work.
That's the first thing you learn in medical school. When you don't even actually know anything, you've got to actually sound like you do.
Well, it comforts the patient.
Actually, absolutely. It's part of the placebo effect.
Well, I guarantee you that exact fact that doctors do that for that reason is probably why your brain does it to yourself.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. But the bottom line that I was trying to get to in my writing, and I think that Dr. Burton did in his also, and I have to thank him for graciously allowing me to quote him quite extensively, is that tolerance. I mean, if you start to realize that so much of what we feel so sure about, when it really gets down to it, the decision between believe, if you're going to believe in something supernatural, beyond not the hoaxy stuff, but the big question of, is there a creator? In the end, that sort of comes down to how you feel about it. I mean, what's the guy that used to be the host at him? Hal Bidlack?
Oh, Bidlack, yes.
Yeah, he's a Christian, and he's still a skeptic, and he's very honest about the fact that, he knows he can't prove that there's a God, but he believes that there is. I believe there should be room for people like him in the skeptical movement, even though I don't share that belief, because he's clear on, this is the point at which I'm going with my feelings.
Right. He says all the time, it's like he's not a Christian, he's a deist, because he can't imagine the events of the Bible being true, but he firmly believes that there's got to be something that did it.
Yeah, and I just heard a lecture at the University of Alabama a few days ago by E.O. Wilson. Do you know who E.O. Wilson? Okay, he's kind of a very famous biologist, and he has a very good new book out called The Social Conquest of the Earth. And he was lecturing, and he is a person who I think earlier has written a book aimed at Christians about, okay, you believe in God, but you need to believe in evolution in order to face the problems that the Earth faces due to, what humans are doing. But my point of tolerance is that a lot of the problems we have is because there's no tolerance on either side. And it's because people take that feeling of certainty and they decide that that's that's a big, almost a magical thing that can't be challenged.
Well, it's also a problem I've noticed many times that when people get sure, even if they are critical thinkers or they know all the science, our certainty that we put our own brains is the same thing that allows us just overlook the fact that we're committing the same logical fallacies all the time that we blame other people for doing because we're just sure about things. So we just do them, and and when people point it out, we get uncomfortable about the fact that we just did that, but you still defend it. So it's got to be, I assume, it's the same part of your brain that says, I'm sure about this, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, one of the things that Dr. Wilson said in his lecture is he has actually, this is kind of in the professional area of evolutionary biology, he was one of the early proponents of the idea of kin selection, and he has recently basically rejected that, and he's proposing with some other mathematicians a different viewpoint that I think he calls multi-level selection. But what's significant about it is he thinks that as far as natural selection and evolution goes for a social creature like us, there's group selection that has a lot to do with the social aspect, and there's individual selection. And he says that the groups at the individual level within a group, it pays to be selfish. The cheaters win on the small scale. But if two groups compete, the group that is altruistic will win. So that means that all through the history of man, there's kind of this yin and yang opposing forces tending to make us altruistic or, have good traits, and forces tending to make us selfish. And so everyone's conflicted. It's part of our evolutionary heritage to be conflicted. But cognitive dissonance doesn't want us to be conflicted. Our brain wants to make a unified story about who we are that says, everyone's brain says, I'm a good person and I'm always kind and nice and blah, blah, blah. So we tend to ignore the times when we don't live up to our image of who we are.
Yeah, it's really funny because there's been a lot more, I wouldn't say breakthroughs, but more discussion about that fact from many different angles. Is it Sam Harris that talks about now the whole thing about free will? And I think it's all in the same zeitgeist to my mind. It's the same reason why we play into false memories that we create on our own, and we do it in groups. So it all feels the same, really, at the core.
Yeah, and when I write about the unconscious origins of certainty, it's really just an example of the fact that most of what our mind does is unconscious. And only a very little of what it does makes it up to the story we tell ourselves. But I think there's more, even a lot of the stuff that you might consider to be part of our mammal brain is unconscious.
So, is there anywhere where people can actually see you recently or sometime in the future?
Okay, well, I'm going to be going to Philadelphia next month for the American Academy of Family Physicians meeting, which I doubt if anyone's going to be there. I'm looking to meet up with people. I'm planning to go to the big New Media Expo in Vegas in January, so hopefully might run into some podcasters. And I'm actually planning to go, this is my big foray into crowds for next year. I'm planning actually to go to South by Southwest. Have you ever gone to that?
Wow, if you like crowds, you'll be happy there.
Yeah, well, somebody that I know that's also involved in medical-related podcasting told me that was the place to go, and then now he's not going after I've already put my money up.
Well, so you're going anyway.
So that's why I'm not giving him credit. Maybe I should send him a bill. And any of you out there that are psychologists, I've now got some of the Brain Science podcasts now have psychology continuing education credits.
Oh.
So, and I'm hoping that will, right now it's only a few episodes, but I'm hoping that it will grow. So anybody that wants to write to me just can write to me at docartemis@gmail.com, and I'll send you the links for more information on that. I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. I think I own page 1 of Google right now as Ginger Campbell.
So if people are going to be out South by Southwest, or if they're going to be in Philadelphia for your big nerdy medical conference.
Yeah, and I think that the New Media Expo might be going to be at the same time as CES, so that'll be another crowd disaster.
Oh. So, New Media Expo, South by Southwest, and a medical conference. And that's the best places to find you in person in the next year.
Yeah, hopefully you won't be meeting me professionally in the emergency room.
No, don't do that. Cool. Well, it's great to talk to you again. It's been a little while, and the book's really good, and it's cheap. So everybody should download it.
Yeah, and please post a review either on Amazon or on Goodreads.
Yeah.
And Derek, please do say hi to Swoopy. I miss her.
I know. We do too. She's been in medical school now for the past couple of years, and she still has more schooling to go.
Yeah, I hope we'll see each other face to face soon.
As usual, you can find the links to Ginger's podcast and where to get her new book in the show notes. This past Labor Day was DragonCon, and everybody knows about that already. But this year at the convention, I was handed the same book by more than just one person. The book was It's Not About the Sex, My Ass. Everybody said the co-author, Joanne Hanks, would make a good guess based on the experiences outlined in the book. So I read the book and I had to agree with them. The book is a story about one woman's personal journey through the world of polygamy as part of a cult based on some misguided fundamental Mormon ideals. As dreary as that sounds, she and her co-author, Steve Kuno, found a way to make the book quite a light read, injecting much-needed humor in the experiences printed in the pages of the book. Joanne was nice enough to set aside some of her time to talk to me about her experience, a bit more about the mysterious elements of the connection between polygamy, the Mormon Church, and what it means to be a woman in that world. So I am here today with Joanne Hanks, right?
Yes.
All right. And you are the co-author on It's Not About the Sex, My Ass.
That is correct.
Could you possibly give us a little insight about who you are and what led you to this book?
Well, I am a skeptic now. I haven't always been one. This experience gratefully led me to skepticism. I had been married for about 5 years when my husband started getting into literature of Mormon history and also a lot of Mormon prophecy. We were both raised as mainstream Mormons. We both have ancestors that go back many generations as Mormons, and obviously many of them in the 1800s that were polygamous Mormons. And so that was a lot of the history, family history, that we were taught growing up. Both of us, well, he grew up in Utah. I grew up in the Air Force, following my dad around. But he retired in Utah when I was only 12, and so I was schooled in 100% Mormon high school, and of course graduated from Brigham Young University. I met my husband through a Mormon dating service. We got married very quickly. And he was a chiropractor. I was an interior designer. And of course, we had to start having a family right away. And he had the tendency to get a little bored quickly, so he would research different things. And one topic that came up was the end times, which was very common for Mormons to talk about. In fact, in one of my religion classes at BYU, the instructor spent a week or two. It was every student's favorite topic was to talk about the millennium, which could happen at any point, we always thought, in our lifetime, where Jesus would return and destroy all the wicked, and we, as the righteous, would have this 1,000 years of peace on earth. And so that was always in my mind, and I'm sure most of the LDS people my age. So as my husband got into studying about the end times, we started finding books, videotape programs that Mormon people, members themselves, had produced their own take on when Jesus would return and all the things leading up to it and how wonderful it would be afterward. And so one thing led to another, and we started meeting with groups of people in their homes to discuss these things. And one main topic was to gather to a safe place, and another was that we'd have to live all the laws of the higher laws of our religion in order to prepare for Christ to come to us. And one of those was polygamy.
Yeah. Now, that's one thing you just touched on right there that I think a lot of people don't realize is how fascinated Mormons are with the end of the world.
Right. In fact, when I was in high school, living here in Utah, fortunately I had grown up in other parts of the country until I was about 12, so I think that's kept me a little bit sane until I moved to where everyone was of the same religion. And so in high school, my girlfriends and I would joke, well, like I said before, everyone's favorite topic in seminary classes, which are taught to high school students, and in religion classes, which are taught at BYU, the millennium was the favorite topic. But even in high school, a friend of mine had a little song she'd sing, someday my prince will come in the millennium, and then he will say to me, will you be my number 3?
Wow.
So a lot of indoctrination from an early age to think of polygamy as kind of a quirky, old-fashioned concept that our ancestors practiced. But then, of course, the church said, well, we abolished it at a certain point. And at the time, and as I recall, most of the experts would say, well, someday it will come back, especially during the millennium. No. And so we knew that in this life after death, we'd be living a polygamous lifestyle.
Now, when you say millennium, that's actually the Mormon buzzword for what most people consider the rapture, right?
I would think so. Where, if I understand that correctly, that's when all of the righteous are lifted up, the wicked are restored, and then the righteous are brought back down to earth, and they get to run everything.
The righteous go to heaven.
Okay, wherever that is. The Mormons' belief is that the earth would be restored to its paradisical glory, and so that's where heaven would be here on a new version of earth.
So it'd be like, back before we had like running water and we pooped in the stream water?
I don't know about that. Nobody ever got specific. That was one of the things that I've learned since in my beginning skeptical steps is to realize that if you can't get specific about it, then with common sense, then it's probably just a story.
So you had a co-author on this book. It was As Told to...
Steve Kuno.
Yeah.
Steve and I have known each other for several years, and he's a great writer. And I had a great experience that I always wanted to have published in some way. And we had talked about, for several years, writing a book. And then the time came when I thought, well, there's so many books out there about polygamy, people leaving the fundamentalist cults. And so ours was not really a fundamentalist cult in that same way. We didn't live in a compound. We didn't dress in old dresses and braid our hair. We were regular people living in a town, small town, close to each other, and led fairly normal lives on the outside. There were just extra wives in the house, and of course the men having a lot of sex with a lot of different women.
But they were all married, right?
They're married, not legally. They're married in the sight of God.
Well, I guess that's all that mattered to them.
Right.
So, according to many of the writings of the Mormon faith, a lot of people don't realize just how oppressive it is to women. I mean, I know that a lot of the Christian books are, but Mormon faith actually has a lot more of that than is quite explicit compared to what people would imagine. Yeah.
Correct. The Doctrine and Covenants, which is a scripture that Joseph Smith came up with, supposedly by revelation, taught many things. There's one section that's still there, that's still in print, that Mormons have in their possession. They have lessons on it every Sunday. And that is that the new and everlasting covenant is celestial marriage, and that in order to make it to the highest degree of the celestial kingdom after we die in this life, that we'd be required to obey these laws, these higher laws. So as we started studying the second coming and thinking that it was very close, we thought, well, we better start living polygamy to prove that we're worthy. So we got it right from our Mormon scriptures, even though we had been excommunicated. Once we started a fairly large group of about 100 families in one town or several towns across this small county, we started being excommunicated from our Mormon groups. We were then forming our own church so that we could live these higher laws.
And that was the true and living church of Jesus Christ of the Saints of the Last Days.
Right.
It's a long name.
Long name. We just called it the TLC.
Oh, like the TV station.
Right. But back then there was no TLC TV station, but there was Tender Loving Care, which was an acronym for TLC.
So, most of us don't realize right now that we're all dead because Jesus destroyed the world about on March 26th of year 2000. So
polygamy wasn't enough in our cult. We have to admit it was a cult. But, you got to realize that most people that are in cults don't realize they're in a cult. They think it's just a small group beginning something great. Just like when Joseph Smith started the Mormon Church. I'm sure him and his family and his few followers thought they were had something new and exciting, and they were starting something great. And it's kind of interesting to wonder what would have happened if it hadn't grown. But because it did, that's what I was born into and indoctrinated into and raised into, and it's affected my life in some positive and some very negative ways. Yes, so we did start our own church.
Everybody hears about the LDS church, which is, and then they have other facets of the Mormon Church. So how did that come about where you have Mormons and LDS, but aren't they all Mormons?
Yeah, I mean, Mormons is just a slang name for members of the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They're called Mormons because the Book of Mormon is the book that Joseph Smith wrote that started it all.
When he looked through the glass in his hat, right?
Put little stones in his hat and looked in his hat and could supposedly have God writing words on the stones, and he could read them and then translate them to his scribe. So he was extremely creative.
That's one way to put it. So when many in these groups reference prophets or getting a calling, when these things are mentioned or these revelations, how do they actually come to somebody? I mean, is it just on somebody's word?
Yes, it is. And the more emotional you can get about it, the more you can get people to believe you. People would say, oh, I got this feeling. We used to call it a burning in our bosom. I referenced that in the book about how men would get a burning in their bosom that they should marry a certain woman, but as I look back on it, I could tell that their burning was a little lower than their bosom. And so...
Well, it's funny because you mentioned that, because it wasn't until around the middle of the book that you actually put the words, it's not about the sex, my ass. And the funny part is, that part of the book, you were kind of gloating about your husband found you more attractive than the younger member of your family.
Yeah, I don't know that I gloated at the time, but it helped me feel more secure in my marriage, and it helped me stay committed to what we were doing, even though my family and society thought we were crazy or knew we were crazy, and we didn't at the time. So I think it was more of a just kind of a security thing. Well, at least I still have a husband and some children.
And looking back on it, you realize that, well, it makes, number one, it made a good title for the book. And it made a good footnote to that story you mentioned about, your husband having sex with other women in your house.
Well, he'd always been very, very interested in other women. Even when we were first married, he just loves women. And he'd been married before. And I'm not saying that all polygamists are philanderers, but obviously they're willing to go through the hassle of money supporting other women and the social embarrassment of being considered a little bit kooky, so that they can have more than one wife. And I don't think it's just about taking care of some poor woman that's divorced or can't find a husband. They seriously think they're better than some other man that she could find on her own, and that they're worth sharing because they're so superior. And I'm sure in their own minds, they like having sex with different women. What men wouldn't. But the problem was, I was indoctrinated or brainwashed to think that was a godly principle and that I needed to go along with it so that I could end up in the celestial kingdom with my husband and my family forever. Mormons are big into families being forever. And so there's always this afterlife that you're preparing for, and sometimes you're willing to do some crazy things here and now. A lot of crazy things, a lot of time wasters, a lot of money wasters to prepare for this future life, which may or may not be real.
Now, you mentioned the celestial kingdom. Is that how they put it? Is that in reference to the belief that the Book of Mormon had about the planet Kolob or anything like that? Is that where that comes from?
I believe so. I was taught when I was young that that Kolob is where God lives. Now, I don't know how you get there. I don't know how God gets back and forth. I guess he somehow can travel through light, and that's why there's always a glowing appearance around some angel when someone says they've seen an angel, like Joseph Smith claimed. There's 3 degrees in the afterlife, and depending on how you lived, where you're rated, God will judge you, and you'll be able to live forever in one of these states of being. And of course, the celestial kingdom is the goal for every Mormon.
You have a interesting section in the book that details a lot of Mormon history. Now, I've heard you had some feedback about that section by other people that are still in the church, and they've told you pretty much what that part is pretty true, right?
As far as Joseph Smith, depends on which history books you read. There's a lot of Mormon history books that are, I believe, whitewashed, and a lot of this detail taken out. And I think that's happened gradually over the years. When we were in our Manti group, we went back to the original writings. And, of course, the original leaders had all these weird ideas that just wouldn't make it in today's society. But there's been, I think, a whitewashing of what Joseph Smith really taught for the church now to say that polygamy was never doctrinal, yet it's in their scriptures right now. So that's misleading. There are so many journals from people's ancestors, my own, my ex-husband's, who spelled out exactly what they went through living polygamy. And they wouldn't have done it if their church leaders hadn't told them they needed to.
Well, yeah, you wrote about how the covenant of polygamy came around 1831 when Joseph Smith and his desire for his wife's 15-year-old housekeeper came about.
Right, and current-day Mormons don't know that story.
I thought that was very fascinating because I hadn't heard that one before myself.
From what I understand, they had a boarding home, and they had some members of the church, some young girls that were maids, housekeepers, waitresses in the boarding home, and Joseph Smith fancied some of them, and about the same time was studying Abraham in the Bible and all the wives he took. And, well, if Abraham is taking all these wives and Joseph thinking he's the current day prophet for God, then why shouldn't he have lots of wives?
He was trying to be one of the original people that were saying that we go back to traditional marriage.
Well, yeah, you can use the Bible to give credit to most anything you want to do. If you can find, the right passage, you can make it fit what you want to happen nowadays, and say that it's okay by God. He started marrying. Some of his marriages were just him and the girl in a barn, and but because he was a prophet, he thought then it was approved by God. Supposedly his first wife caught him once and was peeking through the barn door and saw him consummating one of these marriages.
And that's how the whole thing started?
I think so. And he started taking on more wives. He had some fellow men who thought, I'm not so sure you should be doing this. And so he taught them about the idea of plural wives. And so they started following his example and taking plural wives. Most of the leaders of his time had plural wives. And this went on for decades until the church wanted statehood. And the government said, wait a minute, that's, something that we consider immoral or illegal, and so you're going to have to stop. That's about the time when my great-great-grandfather went to jail several times because he had several wives and he wasn't going to abandon them. So they'd put him in prison for a few months, and then he'd get out and continue probably having children with several wives, and they'd put him back in prison again. And so it's never really died out, especially here in Utah.
Yeah, because you mentioned in the book that one of the original polygamists was Hellman Pratt, and a bunch of Mormons at that time, when Utah made it illegal, they fled down to Mexico.
Right. Helaman. Helaman's a name from the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith came up with.
Helaman.
And Helaman Pratt went down to Mexico to get away from U.S. laws, anti-polygamy laws, and started a big community there. We had some women in our group that were descendants of the polygamists from the Mexican colonies. And so they'd grown up with polygamy and didn't like maybe some of the abuses that were going on in their particular cult, so they came and joined ours. In fact, many of the people in our group in Manti were from other polygamous cults.
Well, it's funny because you mentioned Pratt in that part of the book, and considering when this interview is going to happen, is something that's interesting about Pratt, about his great-great-grandson. Happens to be Mitt Romney. Yeah, which I found very interesting. I didn't realize he had that much of a connection to that.
Right. He has said that his father and his grandfather were not polygamists, but his great-grandfather was. So,
well, he was like one of the originals.
Yeah, he has polygamy in his ancestry, just like I do, just like my ex-husband does, just like many Mormons do. So it was easy for us at the time to leave the current church, join our fun little group in Manti, and start reading and studying a lot of these teachings of Joseph Smith, not just polygamy, but some others, and acting on them, because we were going to prove to God that we could, live these things in real life. So I was ready when my husband and I got down there. No one had started living polygamy yet, and so it almost became kind of a competition. If you're really valiant and strong, you're going to start doing these things. We had families coming to check us out. Other crazy fundamentalist people from around the country, they'd come check us out. They liked what they heard, some of them, and so they'd make arrangements to move. Luckily for Jeff, one family had some really good-looking teenage daughters. And one of them was tall. Both my ex-husband and I are very tall. And so that was kind of the beginning connection there. So we went and visited them in their New Mexico home, and they were anxious to move up. And their daughters had been taught that polygamy would be in their future because their father was a fundamentalist, I guess you could call him. So it wasn't long before we helped them move. And so my husband started dating the oldest one. She was 17. And, of course, she had permission from her parents. So not long after, they decided that she should be his first plural wife.
Now, this is where the point where I have to mention that this is not that long ago. This is not, back in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. No. This was actually quite recent.
This was about 1995. Yeah. She dropped out of high school, I was about 35 years old, both my husband and I, and we have 3 little kids under the age of 4, and we thought we needed a plural wife. So Amanda started courting Jeff. Jeff started courting her. Pretty soon it was planned that there'd be a wedding. There had been a couple of other men. Our leader, Jim, had taken on a plural wife, and another family had taken on a plural wife. And so it was starting to become a little more common within our group, and we had it all down. And so we had this, he had this courtship. I approved. They remained pure before the wedding. And then they went on a honeymoon, which was very difficult for me.
I imagine.
So I was at home with the little kids, and they went off on a trip, and I'm wondering, what are they doing now? And the first morning after they left, he called to say everything was fine and to see how we were doing. And I said, well, have you consummated? And he said no. And I sort of felt relieved. But then I thought, well, it's bound to happen. It's like pulling a Band-Aid off. You might as well pull it off fast. But the next night, they had sex, and the next morning I was able to find out. Didn't hear any of the details, of course.
Yeah, you heard the good news?
Yeah, I heard the good news. And at the same time, I'm having to tell my parents, who live here near Salt Lake, that their son-in-law is off with some strange teenage girl having sex, calling it marriage, and I'm at home with the kids, agreeing to it all. And they were, even though they have ancestors that were polygamists, they were just disgusted by the whole thing, which is a little interesting to think that a couple of generations ago it was accepted. Now it's disgusting and you get excommunicated for it, but in the next life, you're going to be living it.
Well, it wasn't until recently, until that Mormons realized that they should have Utah become a state.
Right.
That's right. How that happened.
I believe so. And there are still plenty of independents that are practicing polygamy. Not just in Utah. There's biblical polygamists who have nothing to do with Mormons, and people who, have other faiths where they believe the Bible proves that polygamy is a good thing. And then, of course, there's other cultures that have polygamy that has, probably more to do with their religion than the actual need to help these poor women survive by having a husband to take care of them and give them lots of children.
And that's the thing that I think many people don't realize, that polygamy is very, very different than, things like polyamory and such that's become pretty, well known in culture. But those two things are very different. Well,
I think for us, in my situation, it was the religious indoctrination that made me feel, and I've heard polygamous girls from, the southern Utah cults say this: if you don't do this, you're going to hell. And they're taught that from a young age. And they believe it. And I knew that if I didn't do this, I'd lose my husband. And there were men in our group who left their wives because their wives wouldn't go along with it. And there was some, what I call now celestial wife swapping, where if a polygamous couple didn't get along too well, another man with equal or greater priesthood could rescue this wife. And so that was kind of our definition of divorce and remarriage. But we had to put it in a way that that made it sound like God approved and that it was all on the up and up.
So I always knew that the Mormon Church was quite homophobic, especially in recent times. The whole hubbub that happened in California when they reversed the proposition where gay marriage became legal, and then now it's not anymore. And then I didn't realize how far it went and then I read the part in your book about the BYU, which is the big university in Utah. They had their university police drive around town to find all the gay hangouts and took down everybody's license plate numbers to see if any students were going to gay clubs?
Right. That's a story I've heard. What I've experienced personally is when we first started going to Manti and meeting with Jim and listening to his take on religion, the local police, who were Mormons, would just drive by his house and see other cars parked out there and take down the license plates, and they'd give it to their church leaders, and their church leaders would pass it on to our church leaders. And so they had information about which of their members were going astray, who was supporting these apostate groups. And so it was obvious because there were leaders in the community in big cities here in Salt Lake Valley and Utah Valley that would give talks about how you can't meet and have your own study groups. You can't plan for the last days. You can't hoard too much food storage. Your supply is okay, but anything more than that means you're going off the deep end. Any kind of survivalist ideas were taboo, and of course, plural marriage and those things. So those were all warning signs that you were not following the leaders.
And that's because the BYU is actually a very strict LDS university.
Oh, most definitely.
And that's the thing that got me is that we're not talking about, just something normal. This is actually the LDS church doing this to people, like very modern day, just actually going around and trying to find people who might be not doing the right thing.
Right. There's a story that just came out yesterday. There's a man who has a website, and he's a member of the church, but he's starting to get too smart and publish some contradictions and try to get people to think, and they're on the hunt for him, and they're looking for excuses, and I'm sure pretty soon he'll be excommunicated.
Which then leads to him not being able to attend university anymore?
I don't know that he is a student.
Oh, okay.
This is a different situation. But you've heard about the student at BYU. See, they have a code of conduct that you sign, and they take it seriously like a contract. And if you do anything outside of that code of conduct, then they'll kick you out of school.
Well, it's a private school, so they can do that, I guess.
Right. But it's pretty well known that, the basketball student who admitted that he'd had sex with his girlfriend was kicked off the team, and he was going to be one of the star players. And we thought, how righteous we are to stick up for our values, even though it's going to cost us games. But there are so many students who are getting away with, normal relationships with boyfriends and girlfriends, and almost like a normal college. But if they don't confess it or nobody turns them in, then they don't get in trouble. So what I'm saying is there's a lot of it going on. It's just that the leaders either choose not to expose it because then they'll they'll have to admit that all these kids are normal, or they just don't know that it's happening.
They haven't had somebody drive around to their house yet.
Yeah, well, they can't keep track of everybody, what everybody's doing, and whether they're in their own rooms at night.
So there's been recently, I don't know, the past few years, there's this big focus by big media, mainly TV, on polygamy. Things like Big Love was on HBO for a few years, and it won lots of awards. And now we have on TLC, nothing to do with your old cult, the channel TLC now has a reality show, Sister Wives. Have you seen any of those?
I watched Big Love for a couple of seasons, but it was too real for me.
Oh, okay, that answers my question then. So
our cult or group was not as tight as the one they portrayed. But that would be more the the ones in southern Utah that are much bigger and almost much more controlling, and they've been doing it for generations. Ours was fairly new. One reporter dubbed us the yuppie polygamists because we were, fairly common citizens. We just happened to have 3 or 4 women living in one home with one husband and tons of kids. But yeah, Big Love, Sister Wives, I did not watch.
Yeah, I was going to say, because Sister Wives sounds a lot more like the yuppie.
Right, exactly. And they were, I would say we were the precursor to them. If they'd done TV stories back in the 90s, we would have been the Sister Wives show because we did a lot of publicity. Our men thought they were missionaries and they needed to go out and gather in the elect and preach to everybody. And so we were on a lot of media for several years. My husband was the head apostle to promote what we were doing. And we had reporters from Sweden and Brazil. The UK did a big documentary on us. We had local reporters coming down, once a year or so, along with the sheriffs. We had John Stossel, 2020, came and did a story on us.
Oh, he's everywhere.
Yeah, he liked the angle of you're consenting adults. Why should this be illegal? And that's kind of the take I think most people are taking now. If they're not hurting anybody, if they're consenting adults, then it should be legal. And I'm not so sure I disagree with that. I think it's great to have freedom and consenting adults. What bothered me the most was the children being raised in this particular religious situation where they really didn't have an option because they weren't well educated enough to know, they were too sheltered to know that there was a life beyond that. And so it was almost like a slave situation where they, were only taught one thing and they were only allowed to live a certain lifestyle, and they had no choice to break away from it.
Well, like you mentioned in that one section of the book that I forget the girl's name, where she said that if she didn't do it, she'd be destroyed.
Right. That was Joseph Smith's first wife.
Yeah.
And that's what, he convinced her, that God would destroy her. And so that's why, to this day, a lot of these polygamous male leaders have power and control over the women. It's because they say, here it is, straight from God. And the women believe that, and they think they're going to be destroyed.
So we have a little discussion here about your book about sex, and a lot of people are like, okay, what does that have to do with like all the skeptic stuff? I said, well, how did you end up with Stephen Novella having a part of your book?
Well, we asked him if we could reprint that, and he was nice enough to say yes, and we felt it fit perfectly with the fact that this was a cult, and he makes some great points about how you can't necessarily tell a cult by its size or what the people wear, but how they act, or even necessarily what they believe. But when they act on those crazy beliefs, that's where you get into the cultish behavior, which I think is controlling and abusive.
Were you much of a follower of the skeptical literature or the going-ons before you started to write the book?
Yes. In fact, when we left the cult, I was still married. We had copies of Skeptic magazine, and it was like a breath of fresh air. It was so wonderful.
My job here is done. I think the interview can be done now.
It was so nice to read the articles and to realize that these people were intelligent and they had common sense, and you didn't have to believe something that was just kind of weird. You know, you just always had a feeling that it was kind of weird, and you needed to be secretive about it, because it just wasn't right. You know, at least for me, no matter how gullible I was and how far into it I got, there was always something in the back of my mind that was like, this is just a little too crazy, because I can't live my life in normal society. So, you know, a lot of people would say, well, society has gone off the deep end and you're the special one. But we liked skeptical things. I have a chapter in my book about George Carlin being my savior, because when we first came out, I don't know whether you consider him a skeptic or what, but when we first left Manti and got cable and watched some normal television, George Carlin was talking about things that I had thought of myself. And I was shocked to hear somebody on TV saying it in a funny way. And I thought, wow, I'm not crazy, or I was crazy, and now I'm getting saner, because it made so much more sense. And so just listening to George Carlin helped to straighten out my brain.
Well, I think he did it for a lot of people.
Yeah. Just the honest, real life, non-mystical approach to things. So you have the book. Are you actually touring the book anywhere, or can people meet you or anything like that? I'm happy to do any interviews. I'm happy to go anywhere and talk about the book. We have it available on I think every place you could actually buy it online: eBooks, Nook, Kindle, Lulu.
Yeah, everywhere.
The website, it's notaboutthesexmyass.com, and there's an excerpt from the first chapter, which I'll let people read, because it's just amazingly disgusting and funny at the same time. There are a lot of other stories in the book that talk about crazy things we did in polygamy, crazy things we did doctrinally. The men went out on a mission to curse the country, to prepare it for destruction before Christ came. And so they traveled all around the country and cursed the state capitals of every state.
Okay.
We planned on Jesus coming. There's a chapter about Jesus coming to us because our leader had decided that March 25th, 2000 was the date. So we prepared for weeks for that. Planned all kinds of banquets. We got lots of food. We figured out what we were going to do with the wicked people who'd been destroyed. We had a huge 2-day special meeting where Christ was going to come to us, and we were going to bring in the millennium. Just this little group of Manti.
Heck of a party.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, because many people who don't realize Manti is actually I guess it was a suburb. It's kind of a suburb of Salt Lake. It's about, 35 miles south?
Actually, it's about 80 miles south.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that far.
It's in central Utah. There's a Mormon temple that's been there forever. And but it's still a very small kind of farming, ranching community. Probably 95% Mormons. And we kind of stuck out. The community was afraid of us. But all they could do, really, was just excommunicate us from the church and just keep an eye on us.
Yeah, so you just made your own.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to talk to me.
It's been fun.
Thank you once again to Joanna for taking so much of her time to talk to me about her experience and journey. As usual, you can find links to where you can purchase Joanna's book and other links to everything you heard about on this episode on our website, Skepticality.com.
Hungry for more skepticism? Want to learn the truth about the scientific controversies of our time? Then subscribe to Skeptic, the quarterly magazine Stephen Jay Gould called the best journal in the field. To subscribe, visit skeptic.com today.